Welcome to The Explainer. I'm so pumped to have you with us today because we are diving straight into one of the most fascinating and frankly consequential military operations of the entire 20th century. We're talking about the infamous 1961 Bay of Pigs invasion. This is a story packed with secret plots, massive miscalculations, and geopolitical stakes that quite literally changed the course of world history. Let's get right into it.
So how exactly did a highly funded, top-secret CIA operation morph into America's most spectacular Cold War disaster? What makes studying this so deeply compelling is the sheer dramatic irony of it all. As we piece together the evidence and the planning today, we know with absolute certainty that this invasion was doomed. Fundamentally doomed before a single boat even touched the Cuban shore.
Act 1. The setup. Let's trace the origins of this conflict.
It's actually wild just how deeply intertwined the U.S. and Cuba were before 1959. American influence on the island wasn't just strong, it was absolute. U.S. citizens owned a staggering 60% of Cuban rural properties. But then, the 1959 revolution happens, Fidel Castro rises to power, topples the U.S.-backed Batista government, and drastically shifts the whole paradigm. He starts nationalizing those properties and steering Cuba rapidly towards socialism. As you could imagine, this directly threatened massive American financial and political interests right in their own backyard.
To really put that sudden loss of control into perspective, just listen to Earl E.T. Smith, the former American ambassador to Cuba. He testified, and I quote, "Until Castro, the U.S. was so overwhelmingly influential in Cuba that the American ambassador was the second most important man, sometimes even more important than the Cuban president. So when Castro suddenly pivoted toward the Soviet Union, well, both the Eisenhower and Kennedy administrations felt an immediate existential threat." Okay, so what is the U.S. response? They devise a highly classified countermeasure. The CIA's covert plan basically had three main steps. First, recruit an army of Cuban exiles who had fled Castro's regime. They became known as Brigade 256. Second, secretly train this paramilitary force of about 1,400 men in places like Guatemala and Nicaragua. And third, launch a surprise amphibious assault right on the Cuban coast. The whole goal here was to use a proxy army to overthrow Castro, all while preserving absolute plausible deniability for the United States.
And this brilliantly illustrates the fatal flaw of the whole operation. The CIA's intelligence leaned on one incredibly massive assumption. They firmly believed that the moment the brigade landed, the Cuban civilian population and local military would just immediately defect and rise up against Castro. But the stark reality? Castro's government knew an attack was coming. They had already arrested dissidents, suppressed opposition, and mobilized a massive, deeply loyal militia. They were literally waiting for the invaders.
Act 2. The action. The invasion is a go. Right before the main invasion, President John F. Kennedy makes a crucial and still heavily debated decision. He drastically reduces the planned U.S. airstrikes. Why? Well, the cover story, that this was just an independent Cuban uprising, was already falling apart on the global stage. Kennedy was terrified that overt U.S. air support would completely expose the American military's hand and risk a direct, hot war with the Soviet Union. But by scaling back that air cover, he left Brigade 2506 disastrously exposed.
What followed was a rapid, just harrowing collapse. Let's walk through this timeline. On April 15, 1961, those scaled-down airstrikes hit Cuban airfields, but they totally failed to wipe out Castro's small but super effective air force. Then, on the night of April 17th, the brigade attempts to land at a remote, swampy area known as the Bay of Pigs, and by April 19th, it is completely over. The invading force is utterly defeated and forced to surrender. Just 3 days of absolute chaos.
To really grasp the nightmare on the ground, listen to this first-hand account from Humberto Lopez Saldaña, a member of Brigade 2506. He recalled, "Every time they hit one of the reefs, they ended up practically destroyed. Bombs fell right next to us. You see, the intelligence on the landing zone was completely botched. What the planners thought was seaweed on the surveillance photos turned out to be razor-sharp coral reefs. Those reefs literally ripped the landing crouts apart, right under heavy enemy fire." The contrast on that battlefield was just staggering. You've got 1,400 invaders trapped against the beaches. Their supply ships are getting sunk by Castro's surviving planes, leaving them with practically zero ammunition. Opposing them? A massive organized force. Fidel Castro took personal control, deploying tanks, heavy artillery, and over 200,000 militiamen who were fiercely motivated to defend their homeland against what they saw as an imperialist, mercenary attack. So the crucial point comes down to this staggering number, 1,100. Out of the 1,400 men who landed, over 100 were killed in action. But a massive 1,100 surviving invaders found themselves completely outmatched, surrounded, and entirely out of supplies. On the afternoon of April 19th, they really had no other choice but to lay down their weapons and surrender to Castro's forces.
And the aftermath for these prisoners was incredibly grim. Johnny Lopez de la Cruz, another brigade member, described the horrific transport to Havana in sealed trucks. He stated, "Inside the vehicle, the detainees are getting desperate. 9 detainees have died during the trip." It's a sobering, really heavy reminder of the tragic human cost that happens when high-level geopolitical strategies fail on the ground.
Act 3. The Fallout. Let's look at the legacy of this invasion.
So those 1,100 captured men were subjected to highly publicized trials in Cuba. It wasn't until December 1962, over a year and a half later, that a resolution was finally reached. The U.S. government enlisted famous attorney James B. Donovan. You might know him. He had previously negotiated spy exchanges with the Soviets. He negotiated directly with Fidel Castro, and ultimately 1,113 prisoners were ransomed back to the United States. The price? Millions of dollars in food and medicine.
Back in Washington, the post-mortem was frankly brutal. A classified report by the CIA's Inspector General Lyman Kirkpatrick concluded the agency had vastly exceeded its own covert capabilities. The operation failed because planners relied on wildly false intelligence and they suffered from severe groupthink. Dissenting opinions were totally ignored, and honestly, no one realistically assessed the risks. They all just assumed Kennedy would ultimately send the U.S. military to bail them out, but he didn't.
The geopolitical backfire here was monumental. An operation intended to overthrow Castro achieved the exact opposite. For the United States, it was a totally humiliating foreign policy failure that completely shattered the myth of an infallible Kennedy administration. Meanwhile, Castro? He was solidified as an absolute national hero in Cuba. Feeling rightfully threatened, he tightened his grip on power and fully aligned his nation with the Soviet Union for protection.
Let's move forward and see how this builds, because Castro now genuinely feared a full-scale U.S. military invasion, so he agreed to let the Soviet Union place nuclear missiles on Cuban soil. This direct chain of events catalyzed the 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis, a nuclear standoff that brought the entire world closer to the brink of a catastrophic nuclear war than ever before or since.
Which leaves us with this final, truly profound question to consider. If a single, flawed covert operation, built on bad intelligence and groupthink, could literally push the globe to the absolute edge of nuclear Armageddon, what are the true limits and consequences of foreign intervention? The Bay of Pigs remains a vital, terrifying cautionary tale about the butterfly effect of geopolitical actions. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. Keep questioning, keep learning, and I'll catch you next time.